Hi, everyone. As people join in, let me just do a brief introduction to our sort of featured book talk speaker. I'll start by telling you who I am. My name is Venkatesh Murthy. I am a faculty member in one of the biology departments in the Cambridge campus in the FAS. I'm also the director for the Center for Brain Science, which is part of this Harvard Brain Science Initiative, which is a university-wide brain initiative which brings everybody together, and that's the entity that's sponsoring this book talk. Let me start by first of all thanking the people who helped organize all this. Parizad, Billy Moria, and Adam Zajac, both of whom are on the call. Thanks for all the hard work getting Karl to talk to us. So Karl Deisseroth, it's a cliche to say needs no introduction, and that's usually unfair, and in this case, even though it's true. So Karl started, I think he probably started his science career well before. If you read his book, you learn. I think he was reading pretty much, I think, from day one when he was born. But the salient thing for us is that he actually went to Harvard College for his undergrad and did his biochemistry degree. And I think that's where he was just talking to John Dowling, who taught him the introductory neuro course. That's where he, I think, got this little bit of the neuroscience interest. And afterwards, he went off to Stanford and got his MD and PhD there. And that's where, basically that sort of the big things started happening. As you all know, Karl is very well known for optogenetics, as well as the tissue clearing methods, clarity, and so on. And Karl, I think by now you will know, because you were here at the book talk, is also deeply involved in a human clinical care, and he's been a psychiatrist, seeing patients for a long time. And this seems to be an equal part of his endeavors and his interests over the years. And so he's sort of mingled basic neuroscience research with applied neuroscience research, as well as seeing patients. And the book, when it came out, actually it came out like following on social media and Twitter. It was quite a kind of a blaze of coming out, where Karl, like, wait, he has time to write a book, write all this amazing stuff. And I think there it is, right? It's a book, and he wrote this book. I believe it's your first formal book, Karl, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Projections, which we're very, very glad to hear more about. Karl has won numerous awards, starting with, I'll tell you, the John Harvard Scholarship when he was at Harvard in a college student in biochemistry, all the way, I think the most recent one, and I can remember, forgive me, Karl, is I think probably the Heineken Prize. But meanwhile, he's won just about every named prize, probably like the things that you'll know, Breakthrough Prize, a bunch of the National Academy prizes. And so he's a member of a large number of august societies, and does it all. And so it's a great pleasure. I can also say that I have been delighted to know him for some time. I think since he was, were you already a grad student? I think at the time we took an imaging course in Cold Spring Harbor, at the time taught by Jeff Lichtman and Steve Smith and George Augustine, and I got to know him first. I think he was probably all of 22 years old or something, and I think you could already sense that this man is going places. And I've been glad to have known you all this time. And take it away, Karl.
Thank you, Venki. It's really very poignant and quite a little bit of nostalgia to, even by Zoom, to reconnect with the Harvard audience. I have so many great memories. We were chatting just before we started here about how Harvard Square has changed a lot, but apparently Pinocchio's is still there. I used to sneak out there and get cheesesteak sandwiches and pizza at night after coming back from lab. I used to ride this Rattly shuttle bus, the M2 bus from Cambridge to the medical school and back, and a significant fraction of my life was spent on that bus. But a lot of very wonderful memories, and of course John Dowling, his Bio 25 course was a formative moment in my life. So it's really great to reconnect with everybody. And Venki, I remember spending most of that imaging course summer at Cold Spring Harbor. I think I was playing Minesweeper most of the time, so you might have been mostly impressed with my Minesweeper skills, but a little bit of knowledge did find its way in. And I really enjoyed working with you. It was really great. And obviously great things came for many people from that course, including you and many others. It was such an amazing collection of people. Yeah, but I'm also, this whole writing thing, what's the deal with that? This was my first passion, actually, as a child and a young adult. That's what I saw myself becoming, was a writer. And I loved how words would make people feel, would make me feel, and I wanted to understand that. And when I went to college, though I was sort of drawn in by the revolution in biomedicine that was happening at the cellular level, from in immunology and developmental biology and cancer and other fields, and I conceived a desire to link that excitement to my interest in human feeling and how it comes from words and interactions. And so but that led me away from writing, and so I ended up majoring in biochemical sciences at Harvard, and then I went to Stanford. I did a MD PhD in psychiatry residency, which is a whole story in itself, how I picked psychiatry. And then the lab science that Venki introduced came after that. But all the way through, I still wanted to be a writer, and I was secretly writing. So this book is, in many ways, it kind of came together over about 20 years. In fact, I wrote the first chapter right after September 11, 2001. There was a patient who came to my care in the emergency room. I was still in psychiatry training. I was a resident, and this was a patient who had never had a psychiatric illness in his life, nor anybody in his family, but he was flipped into a pure, complete manic state by the events of September 11th. He had no direct involvement with it. He was living in California, no more direct connection than anybody else in the country. And that was a very meaningful moment. We were able to help him, first of all. So, and he became a story. His story is told with, of course, the details changed, but his for privacy, but his story is there. And that made me think very deeply, I thought, about the nature of psychiatric illness and the nature of alterations in human emotions that come with the disorder. And I wrote a story. I wrote a chapter about it back then, almost 20 years ago. And over the years, I kept seeing patients. I do both inpatient and outpatient work. I have a weekly clinic where I see patients focusing on depression and autism spectrum disease. And then I do inpatient work about 1 week a year at the Stanford Hospital and clinics, where it's what comes in is all over psychiatry, every imaginable thing you can see in acute psychiatry. And as all these experiences continued over the last 20 years, and as I was building and developing the optogenetics and the hydrogel tissue chemistry methods and others, and making what are still I think not significant enough steps, but little steps in understanding neural circuitry, trying to draw connections and writing more and more along the way. And then it reached a crescendo a couple years ago. I still didn't quite have the get up and go to do it, but I got called by a literary agent who had heard about me and said, "Hey, I heard you've got something written. Can you write more?" And I said, "I don't really have time." But he was very persistent, and once I started doing it, it became addictive. I became truly, I would look forward to the writing each day, and I would do it mostly at night, late at night, after midnight, sort of 12 to 2, sometime 12 to 2 a.m. I would sometimes get up in the early morning and write. But it was no problem because it was so compelling. It brought me back to that initial love I'd had of words and writing, the joy of picking and finding the right word. And so for a couple of years from, sort of 2017 to 2019, it became quite consuming. I usually write, a couple of reviews a year as well. That plummeted completely. So I had no reviews of any kind scientifically in that time, because all my energy was completely devoted to this, to the book. And then it came together, and just about a month ago, it came out. And so that's the brief origin story of the book. And definitely, if people have thoughts, I know there's a question period that we'll have at the end, but if there are any aspiring people who want to share their experiences or ask questions about that sort of transition, I think it's a secret love and a secret skill that many of us in science have, and a short thing I can say now is if you can do it, if you can find the time, do it. It's incredibly liberating. It's wonderful to make that connection across different realms of the human experience. So we could talk about that a bit later.
Yeah, I should interrupt Karl to say, like, I failed to tell people that I think we're hoping that starting around 4:30, a little bit, maybe a couple of minutes after that, we'll open it up to question and answer, and we'll do the audience is large enough that I don't think we can just shout out. So please do the raise hand, or maybe easier, just type it in the chat, and then I can just kind of pick collate a few of those things and ask. But you'll have a chance, and I think that's actually an important part of this discussion.
Okay, wonderful. And a couple things we could do. As some of you might know, I had a great conversation with Catherine Dulac not too long ago about the book. But one thing we didn't do there was any kind of reading from the book. It was more of a wonderful conversation. But one thing I could do is read a couple passages from the book in the time we
Please.
have. Yeah.
Yes.
And so one thing I tried to do in the book, there are stories. Each chapter is really a human story focused on a different domain of psychiatric illness. And I try to capture the feelings that are stirred by use of words and use of language. And it's different in each chapter. So in the chapter on mania, I try to let the exuberant possibilities of language out. It's definitely over the top, but it's supposed to be, because mania is that it's the furthest expression of human emotion that you can imagine, and human connection and charisma and outwardly directed energy. And then there are chapters on grief that are very different, and there's one on schizophrenia or psychosis where the language becomes very fragmented, and so I try to adapt it in each case. But what I'll do first, I could read a little bit from the mania chapter, and this is the patient who had the experience after September 11th, and so you can get a flavor of the use of language. Okay, I have my book here. For a week after September 11, Alexander was just a bit on the stoic side, only revoicing the common thoughts of shock and pain around him. He read stories of the victims, but then began to focus on two of them, a father and a daughter, a pairing he had not lived personally. A scene emerged and grew more detailed, and he spoke to his family of imagining their final moments, while inside his brain, a secret remapping had begun. In ways still mysterious, new synapses were formed and older connections were pruned away. Electrical patterns shifted as scripts were overwritten. For a week, his biology silently learned its new tongue, and then it reached out, expressive at last. The first manifestations were physical. He nearly stopped sleeping, becoming fully alert and charged with life for 22 hours a day. Never the chattiest before, Alexander now could not hold back a vast volume of words that came out in a pressured torrent, turbulent and interjaculating, yet still coherent at first. The content of his speech changed too. He was saltier, charismatic, uplifting, and illuminating. Beyond language, his whole body was affected. Now ablaze in new youth, he was suddenly voracious and hypersexual. No old bull out to pasture, he was an organic being newly ready to interact, to react, to interface. His skin surfaces were functionalized and available. Life was lacier, compelling, alluring. Projects and goals came next. They were valorous and numerous with a tinge of excitement, a sub-thrill of risk. He bought a new Dodge Ram pickup with heavy-duty trailer hitch and extended cab. He ran all night, read books all day, and studied theory of war, writing pages on the movements of forces and reserves. A theme of self-sacrifice appeared and grew stronger. He wrote letters volunteering to join the Navy and was found one evening rappelling down a redwood trunk in the fog, training for war. He was breaking from his lifelong chrysalis, transforming into a newly emerged monarch. There had been a certain charm to the transition up to a point, but then he veered into thoughts of good, evil, death, and redemption. He had dwelt until this event in a sort of unperforated Lutheranism, stormless and modestly nourishing, with minimal connectivity to any other part of this life. Now he began to speak with God, first calmly, then frantically, then in a scream. Between these prayers, there were sermons for others in which he became irritable, swinging between euphoria and crying. Nearing midnight before admission, he ran from the house with his whale gun, throwing branches and bark at his sons as they tried to stop him in the yard. Police found him 2 hours later at bay in a thicket near a dry stream bed, ready to strafe the stinkweed. They took him and subdued him with the mundanities of medical legal incantations, all the energy still brimming up behind his eyes like tears. Okay, so that's a window into the manic experience, and it's still, when I read it, I'm kind of brought back to that moment. I'm feeling this sort of charge and energy that was present in the room. It's a very odd experience to encounter someone who's in a full-blown mania. The energy is palpable, and even it can have a positive tinge to it. You really start to see anything is possible when you're speaking with someone who's in a mania. You start to feel it, and it is a little bit sad in some ways to end up treating patients and bringing the mania under control. And that theme of the ethics of intervention also is touched on in the story. So that's sort of on the positive side, not positive in the sense of health, but positive in the sense of being on this elevated side of the mood spectrum. Now, another thing I could read has to do with borderline personality disorder. And here, it's not uplifting at all. It's definitely on the other side. Thank you. What do you think? Should I go right into that, or?
I think so. I think we're kind of heading up in 8 to 10 minutes, and so I think that would actually just give people thoughts, then ask questions.
Okay, good. Yep. And that way you can get the full spectrum, as it were.
Yep.
Okay. So this chapter opens with a quote from Toni Morrison, her book Sula, and I have to read that because, well, you'll see. The chapter is called Broken Skin. And the quote is, "As willing to feel pain as to give pain, to feel pleasure as to give pleasure, hers was an experimental life. Ever since her mother's remarks sent her flying up those stairs, ever since her one major feeling of responsibility had been exercised on the bank of a river with a closed place in the middle. The first experience taught her there was no other that you could count on. The second, that there was no self to count on either. She had no center, no speck around which to grow." That's from Toni Morrison, Sula. Okay, this chapter begins with an encounter in the emergency room again. Henry, 19 years old, had been found rolling naked on the aisle of a county bus. When the paramedics arrived, he told them that he was imagining eating people and saw visions of himself consuming flesh and bathing in blood. But after his swift transport to our emergency department by the police, Henry gave me, the on-call psychiatrist, someone to evaluate him, a more relatable story instead, with more universal themes. He described the lost love that had brought him to despair, to the aisle of the bus, to suicidal thoughts, and to me. Not even guessing at his diagnosis yet, there were still too many possibilities. I let my mind work freely, picturing the scene as Henry described his magical first moment of romantic connection from 3 months ago. In her short fur-lined coat, Shelley had knelt on the torn vinyl seat of the church field trip bus, leaned close and kissed him, just as a sunbeam unexpectedly broke through the canopy of trees and fog. More used to the pervasive chill of early spring among the coastal redwood groves, he was surprised and enthralled by the sudden dense warmth on his skin through the window glass. Shelley's own warmth, the excited heat from her hungry red lips, brought her together with the sun in him. She was connecting him to everything, and connecting to everything in him. But now, not 3 months later, everything was lost again, and the midsummer sun had somehow turned freezing. Henry gestured, showed me how he had covered his eyes, hands together, fingers interlocking, to block the sight of her driving away from the parking lot of the diner where she had met to break up with him just 2 days ago. He had been shielding himself from the image of her bright red rear taillights as she left him to find another. Nothing remained for Henry. He had no connection to her nor to anyone else, it seemed. Henry's blockade of the scene of her departure seemed an oddly immature defense, I thought, more suited to a toddler than a grown man. He was mid-performance, reenacting here in room 8, and watching me instead of his hands, closely tracking my reaction. As I looked on, and as he lifted his arms higher, the sleeves of his loose sweatshirt fell back to his elbows, exposing forearms crisscrossed in fresh razor slashes, crimson, crude, brutal parallelograms. A big reveal, an intended one, it seemed, of agony and emptiness. His barren core was now visible through his own shredded skin. So the story, I'll read one more bit, which is from the same story. It's the end of the same story. So that's the beginning, and it's a story of the patient and how we worked on diagnosing and trying to help treat. And the end of the chapter is the last bit I'll read. There had been a hearing process where there's often a tension in patients who come into the hospital, whether they will remain or whether they'll go. And this is an interesting drama that happens between and among the doctors and the justice system and patient advocates. And a lot of the details of that, which are quite interesting and compelling, are discussed. But Henry ended up being discharged. And my thoughts are at the end here. If I had played the hearing differently, I might have found some way to keep him. Holds in California can be placed or extended, not just for suicidality, but also for danger to others and for grave disability. But despite Henry's rage, he was not violent and never had been to others. His bloody visions were just that, a churning of violent imagery, not coupled to the power stroke of action. This left only the route of finding evidence for grave disability. Perhaps a plausible argument could be imagined from his nakedness on the bus, a case to be made for his inability to provide for at least one of the basic needs, triad, food, clothing, and shelter. But Henry undeniably had and knew how to access resources addressing all his needs. The bus incident, like his cutting, was serious but not lethal, and so Henry stepped out of the unit on a foggy Sunday morning. I watched him walk down the hall toward the escalator and the main hospital exit, canvas bag over his shoulder. He was uncured, untreated even, but I told myself there was little more that could have been done. His was a disorder untouchable by medication. He had wanted to leave soon after admission, and upon discharge, he had refused even my outpatient referral for a specialized group behavioral therapy. The clinical literature predicted Henry's future would include more of these parasuicidal actions like cutting that were revenging and rewarding in ways I would never fully understand. His wounds would heal and then reappear as relief continued to come from the act for him, a desired injury, a counterstrike against internal suffering beyond my imagination. Henry had no choice. For a time, he would have to continue to seek these stigmata and to seek others, not skin to skin, but self to self, coercing human warmth across space and time. His destiny in the long run could be the mellowing of borderline symptoms that usually comes with age, but time could instead bring suicide, the ending of the self, at a rate of 15%, the highest incidence for any disease, any burden of humanity. One hope was that those who cared for him could learn to use the state he was able to evoke in them, projecting that ancient feeling of the invaded self, magnified 100-fold back onto their own internal representations of Henry. Powerful empathy can be stoked from sparks of anger. My own flare of rage had long since died away, though I knew I was still vulnerable to him and would always be. Henry projected into me and was close to me as the written word is close to paper. but I felt that I had exhibited to him only a pleasing dupability in my earnestness to reduce his pain. And for a time, I couldn't see my son without thinking of Henry. He had written his story atop my own, like a medieval monk inscribing new text upon a scraped and reused parchment, carving symbols of judgment and revelation onto animal skin stretched thin. So that is the borderline chapter. You can see a different feel for sure. In each of these, I do try to draw links with neuroscience, with advances in neurotechnology, and with the broader picture of the human story and human evolution. But those different perspectives, human evolution, modern neurotechnology, and the clinical experiences are all wound up together, and it provides an interesting, I think, perspective on these disorders.
Great. Well, thanks, Karl. Amazing. So that's actually, I love the way you kind of contrasted the two. And I mean, I hadn't quite internalized reading the book that the styles were, kind of really matched or adapted to the particular disorder. And then it's beautiful. It's great to hear that. So I think before I kind of open up people, I thought I'd maybe just start off by asking you a couple of quite sort of pre-prepared questions just to get the ball rolling. And I think they're kind of, you can imagine answering them related. So I'm going to just ask both of them, and you could sort of choose how you want to answer them. One is more of like maybe related to what you just said. Typically in science, at least in sort of 21st century science, we're sort of persuaded to write in this somewhat crisp, sterile, state the facts, no clauses within clauses, no metaphors, that sort of thing. And then whereas, writing that we always enjoy out in the wild, if you will, often has all these complications and rule breakings and whatnot. So I think my first question is like, how do you consciously sort of balance this as you do? Like, how does it go? And it's a personal thing. So whatever you want to say about that, that's one question. And the related question, which can be maybe interpreted more scientifically, but you can also do it literally if you want. I've sort of wondered reading your book that what we mean by explanations for things feels like maybe different when you're dealing with patients in psychiatry versus when you're doing neuroscience. When I want to explain, I don't know, decision-making in neuroscience, right? There's a certain way we kind of approach, and what's considered explanation is in some sense far more mechanistic, whatnot. Whereas in patient care, when you sort of try to explain. So I'm just sort of curious how you blend all of these. Do we have to blend, or do you make conscious choices about those?
Yeah, great questions both. I'll tackle the second one first. The great thing about psychiatrists, if and they're an unusual bunch. I can say that. There are definitely some oddities in the psychiatric community, but I love them all. And one of the great things about them is they well know the limits of their understanding. And so they typically don't even talk about explanations. They use a different word, which is formulation. So the way they think about a patient, it's a formulation. There's not a mechanistic explanation for anything. And people try. I've tried. Not trying to discredit those who do try, but in psychiatry, we have so far to go in terms of basic understanding that we usually don't even use the word explanation. But in formulation, you think about the psychological, you think about the biological, and you think about the social, and you wrap them together and you present it as if it's a unified, coherent picture that all makes sense. And that is very different from most realms of medicine. I think as much as I enjoy that, because it's such an interesting intellectual exercise, it's changing. And I think we are rapidly moving toward explanations. Not there yet, but what neuroscience is doing is moving us very quickly in that direction. My automatic lights keep turning off here. That's a power saving measure we have. Now, your first question, though, which is the use of words in scientific writing, I definitely found with writing the book it was much more liberating than typical scientific writing for sure. But I freely admit that my scientific writing, I use long complex sentences with many embedded clauses, sets of commas, em dashes, and so on. And I love I love constructing sentences when I write that have their own symmetry and rhythm. And I even do often sneak in a little bit of, often in reviews usually, but I do try to become a little bit unmoored from the dry language that we often feel we have to use. So that's the other nice thing about the book, though, is it let me really release from the usual conventions. And of course, I'll go back to it, to the scientific writing immediately. But it was everybody who might be feeling that same thing. Keep writing, write your things down. It could take 5 years or 10 years, but just keep writing and store it away. And when the time is right, put it together and share your experiences. It will be very liberating.
Great. Yeah, I think I encourage again people to to type in the chat or raise your hand, and we could see. So I have one question already from John Vastola, which if you were to paraphrase Karl, you can read it too. It's basically you're talking about these different things and how does the world of, for example, clinical psychiatry and your neuroscience experience, how do they connect, and how does it help each other, right? Thinking about the brain versus the mind in some sense.
Yeah. It's one thing I've done in having a life that spans different domains like this is to try to make sure that the different domains help each other and don't seem to be pulling away from each other. And that can be hard. A lot of people who do clinical medicine and science, they end up feeling just pulled. They feel pulled apart, and it's a very unpleasant feeling. Whenever you're doing one thing, you have a very visceral sense that you're not devoting the appropriate energy to the other side. And you can sustain it for a few years, but it's very hard to sustain for a full career. That sense of not doing justice to one side or the other is very unpleasant and strong. And so the only advice I would give is something I have tried to do myself is to try to shape them both so they help each other. So they're syntonic, as we say in psychiatry. They're working together toward a common goal, and it can even be a fig leaf, a cover story, just enough to fool your subconscious into not being too tortured. The patients I pick, clinics have themes and types of patients, and it's a partial specialization. And I see patients that I can tell myself do relate to the things I'm interested in the lab. And the questions I study in the lab, I can tell myself do relate to the patients, and that really helps. So that's one way to keep things sustainable, and it's working so far. But the question also asked, does writing about the brain and mind from these different points of view in your book, does it make you view any of these relationships in a new light? I definitely, the process of writing the book was self-educational immensely as well. I learned a lot about myself. It wasn't until I'd finished the book that I noticed there was an overarching theme in every chapter, which I'm not going to say here, but it was a surprising theme. And I mentioned this in the epilogue, what that theme is. And I didn't know I had this this very deep issue. And and only when the book was done did I see that. So yeah, you can see, you can learn a lot about yourself with this too. So I'm really glad I did it. It was like a dose of self-therapy.
Fabulous. John Dowling.
Yes, Karl, I'm interested in your first case of mania.
Yeah.
How do you treat that these days? Lithium used to be the way you would treat bipolar disorder, but that's a little different from just pure mania. How did you deal with that patient?
Yeah, so lithium is still widely used. So, with bipolar, you have the mania. Very often there are separate episodes of depression that can show up, and those would be the two poles of bipolar. But a single manic episode suffices to earn the diagnosis of bipolar disorder type 1 without even having had yet a depressive episode. And lithium works for bipolar disorder, still widely used. It's actually, you have to check a few lab tests along the way, make sure you're not adversely affecting the thyroid and the kidneys and a couple other things. But in general, it works really well, still widely used. I have patients that I prescribe lithium to. It works beautifully for them. We check their blood every few months. And it's a great medication. There are a lot of newer ones that we'll use for patients who have, who might have kidney trouble or thyroid trouble, or if there's another reason they don't tolerate lithium. And these are called the mood stabilizers. There's actually some of them are anti-epileptics originally, some of them are antipsychotics originally. They act through a host of different mechanisms or formulations, you might say. Nobody really knows the exact mechanism of action, but there's a wide panel of medicines now that do work for bipolar and help keep people stabilized, bringing mood down from above. There are also some, but not all of these help people who are in bipolar depression. So some people, will present to care who have had past manic episodes, but now they're in a depressed state. And for them, you'll typically make sure they're on a mood stabilizer like lithium, and then you'll also give them an antidepressant. A really interesting and unfortunate thing that can happen if you don't have them on a mood stabilizer like lithium, and you just give them an antidepressant when they're in their depressed state, it can bring them past healthy into mania. And so you always want to make sure you've got the mood stabilizer on as well. And that can be lithium, and it could be other medications as well.
Do we have any idea how lithium works?
There's a lot of science being done around that, and has been done for many years. Lithium certainly has numerous measurable effects on various biochemical signaling pathways, as do other agents. There are a number of people who would look for commonalities, given that there were so many diverse drugs which helped with mania. There was a branch of science that went on for a while, and is still going on, where people will give, will look for shared biochemical signatures of all these incredibly diverse drugs that all happen to work on mania. And people have found, some pathways that are suggestive. But that hasn't really, I would say, led to deep understanding, nor to the creation of new, truly specific treatments. And so I would say we're still lacking an explanation. We're lacking a truly deep understanding. My hope is the advent of circuit neuroscience, which is a new perspective, will give us the right level of understanding we need.
Great. So there's actually a sort of a direct message question, Karl, before we go to somebody who's raised their hand. There's a question about what your thoughts are on the intersection of sort of your work in the book and others on consciousness.
Yeah. I get into that only at the end. Of course, we all think about consciousness. We all love thinking about it. It's such an interesting thing, and it has all the challenges that I and everybody else could tick off right away and even attempting to approach it as a scientific question. But what I tried to do in the book is to more frame the problem rather than make any attempt to solve it. And I think modern neuroscience actually does provide some useful ways to frame consciousness as a problem, and that shows up in the epilogue of the book as well. There's some thought experiments that you might find interesting relating to the question of consciousness, but it's a framing of the problem. I'm sorry, I don't have answers.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. So Ming Tong's hand up.
Hi, this is Ming. I was with MGH and I was at the NIMH. And, one burning question I still scratching my head is that, from your perspective, either psychiatric or neuroscience, my high school teacher always asked me when I study the basic biology is that, what is the biological significance? So my question is, using the same frame of reference, what is the biological significance of human emotion? Well, I can narrow it down. This is a big topic. For instance, if I'm anxious, I have anxiety. it would be very helpful. It might help me to pass the exam, or I can do a better job, with school performance if I, keep a certain level answer. But of course, if I move all the way, scale up, then I might be pathological. So I can understand, for instance, being suspicious, being paranoid, being delusional paranoid, I may help to protect myself. Okay. But what is the biological significance of depressions?
Yeah, this is actually I address these questions pretty much head on in the book for every story, every condition that I address. That's front and center. It's a big part of the book, thinking about why this very simple question. And here's where modern neurotechnology actually does help us. And anxiety is one of them. And so this was, optogenetics work that we did back in 2013, and then work that Catherine Dulac did and reported in 2018, showing how complex behavioral states like anxiety, or in her case, the parenting behavior, how these states are assembled from different features or subparts. And in the case of anxiety, exactly to your question, anxiety has this aspect of avoiding risky situations. That's a behavioral manifestation. It also has physiological effects. There's elevated heart rate, elevated respiratory rate. And then, but finally, there's this aversive quality. It feels bad. And it's not obvious why you need the feeling bad part if you're already avoiding risky things. And that is a question that really optogenetics has helped us understand. There are particular projections across the brain that are responsible for recruiting the different features of anxiety. And we can activate or inactivate these with optogenetics and add or delete that feature of the brain state. And they all get assembled by a master control region. Same with parenting. Catherine and her colleagues showed that the different aspects of parenting and going out and finding and collecting the young and then actually caring for them and grooming them, those are manifested by different projections coming from the same control region, and they're assembled together. And so there's a fair bit in the book on how and why that can come to be, and why these feelings seem to be an important part of the brain state. And so if you're interested in that, I think there'll be something there for you.
I fully understand this, just like, from the comparative zoology, the polar bear, the mother polar bear, or the, lioness, or, the female rodent, after, pregnancy, they get the anxiety so they can protect, the cubs. But, I don't understand why in human or in certain type of animal, dog, or, some other, primate, why they get depressed. What's the biological significance of depressions?
Yeah,
That's my burning question.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, there's a whole chapter on that. Take a look very briefly. And a lot of modern neuroscience has related to that. It is this sort of passive coping state is actually a valid way of addressing challenges. It can become extreme. It can become maladaptive, as we say.
Yes.
But it has its own significance and utility to not expend excessive energy if the challenge is truly insuperable. But and that by itself is fine. That makes sense. But why does it have to feel bad is the other question, and that is in many ways the core issue that we'd all like to understand. But take a look. It is there in the depression story.
Great. There's actually a few more questions. So let's, if you don't mind, let's move on. So I think Parizad had a question about, in the book you write that, as a psychiatrist, you want to kind of have this impulse to connect deeply and understand the problem. But of course, you also want to maintain the distance so that you can, first of all, help many patients, but also be dispassionate. And the question is like, what's your personal take on how do you balance that?
Yeah, this is a big challenge. It's not, of course, unique to psychiatry. Even medicine, people, crisis workers and others have the same issue. How do you care enough to be good at your work and to be a human being, and yet not care so much that you can't sustain it. And I in the first chapter, which is called Storehouse of Tears, I talked a little bit about those strategies. Everybody maybe gets to a different personalized strategy, but for me, what I do is I try to feel a part of the picture deeply and fully, but not the full picture, which can be overwhelming. And it's a way to feel as a human being should, but without making yourself completely vulnerable, so you can't go forward. And that's a big risk, and I almost hit a point where I couldn't go forward. So it's a big deal, and has to be solved by everybody.
Great. Vicente had his hand up again.
Yeah, thanks. So one topic that I relate to themes in the book is the complex relationship between some psychiatric conditions and social interaction. I understand some diseases are treated by conversation. There seems to be an important influence of the external social input and emotional connections on the course of some psychiatric diseases. So my questions are is depression contagious? Are there strict individual boundaries in psychiatric disease? Could there be social diseases or perhaps exist in the future of evolution?
Yeah, that's a good question. There definitely are epidemiological hints that certainly certain manifestations of depressive behaviors can exhibit contagion-like dynamics. There can be unusual clusters of suicides, for example, which clearly represent some version of that. And a lot of people are thinking hard about how to address that. And I mentioned how mania is, at least briefly, has a brief sense of contagion. Same thing with depression. It's very hard to walk out from seeing and trying to help a depressed person and feel truly upbeat for a little while. And so we definitely have those. If we do connect, if we do let ourselves connect, there is some aspect of contagion. That's more on the transient personal side. I think you're asking a very much larger scale question of, at the population level, can there be propagation, contagion-like propagation of psychiatric symptoms? That I think it probably doesn't happen to any significant extent in our world, but you could definitely point to cases like the suicide clusters where it's pretty clear populations can respond and there can be contagion-like epidemiology. Pretty interesting topic, probably studyable in some ways in the lab, although without recapitulating the full complexities of human society, probably hard to get a true causal understanding.
Great, thanks. So in the chat, Heather has a question. So from a perspective, the top of the neuroscience research, do you have any advice for someone getting started at the bottom? It's not really bottom, the beginning stages. That's what she means. For example, as a grad student, what advice do you have?
Yeah. Well, this is I'm always a little hesitant because I don't at all pretend to have any kind of good answers or advice. Every situation is different. The world's always changing. People are changing. So with a big grain of salt, though, I do think it's extremely important to make sure you're studying something that really gets you excited, that truly is beautiful to you, that you, when you wake up, you think about it. When you go to bed, you think about it. And that relates to this theme I mentioned earlier about not feeling pulled in different directions. You're best if you feel like you're doing what you're supposed to be doing, what you were built for and designed for. And finding that can be a challenge. I certainly, my first project in grad school, I did not feel that way at all. And it took a few tries to get there, to feel that. And so maybe one practical advice, if you can do it, is to, make sure you work on a couple projects, increase your chance of finding that thing that really is you. And the last thing I'd say, have a decent chunk of your time even half, have it be on developing new things. You know, there's this historical divide between scientists and engineers, where the engineers have felt like they have to build things, or technologists, they have to create technologies, and the scientists are more the discoverers, you know, the ones who truly know the biological system and are guided by that and hypotheses that come from that. I think that's a false divide. I recommend to my students to devote, you know, a major fraction of their time, on the order of half, to developing new methods. In many ways, it's going to ease your path. It'll ensure that you are doing things that will intrigue and surprise you and other people. So that, just a couple bits of advice, but you know, I don't claim to have any real answers.
Great. So we're going to the raised hand. Matt Johnson had a question about alternate methods of therapy beyond, like, for example, medication or talk therapy, and it gives examples of other things. So I don't know. I just don't want us to get into a more of a medical kind of a description, but maybe in the spirit of sort of a book talk, what would you suggest, Karl?
Yeah, I mean, for depression, for my depressed patients, I try to take the whole picture. I really advocate exercise. I really advocate, to the extent possible, increasing human interaction. It can be hard in depression to do both of those things, but if you can, they really help. This is you know, words and actions of other people, they are more precise than any current medication or brain stimulation treatment. I'm a big believer in what most psychiatrists know, is that words can help, words can heal, and actions and words can help and heal. They work well together with medications, and in very severe cases, and even moderate to severe cases, you definitely need medications as well. But you know, the alternative methods, including exercise and interactions with others, are very powerful, no question about it.
Great. Gustavo Acharya had the hand up.
Yes, good afternoon. I had the pleasure of actually already read the book. I love your summary because the question is actually, you touch a little bit on this issue of the mind, nature, nurture, things like that. Question is, when do you think this optogenetics is going to be applicable in human therapies or interventions?
Yeah, well, the broader answer is that, you know, it's really a discovery tool. It's a way to understand the system, and once you understand this mysterious organ better, then any kind of therapy will become better. It'll become more firmly grounded in what really matters, the true mechanism, and whether that's a medication that targets the cells and circuits that you've identified as causal with optogenetics and other methods, that's enough. Then you can say, okay, we're going to design a medication that, you know, interacts with the GPCRs that are specific to those cells and circuits that we now know are causal in the symptom, because, you know, when you cause the activity in those cells, you cause the symptom. When you take it away, you take away the symptom. That's a pretty darn good foundation to stand on that we didn't really have before at the circuit level. And the knowledge can be derived from optogenetics, but you don't have to directly put in, you know, genes from algae and fiber optics into human brains. So that's the big picture answers. It's a discovery tool, really. Now, that said, about 10 years ago, you know, we collaborated with my friend and colleague Botan Roska and published a paper where what he did was he took one of our optogenetic tools and put it into a cadaveric human retina and showed you could modulate activity in human retinal cells. And then just, you know, a month or two ago, he showed that you could do this in a living blind human being. You could introduce a optogenetic tool, microbial opsin, into the retina of a blind person and confer some light sensitivity back onto that person. So it is already happening in the direct sense, but I think the bigger implication is always this pure discovery value.
Thank you.
Thanks. And so we're kind of heading up against the 5 o'clock thing, which, you know, Karl has obligations to go. So I'm afraid I won't get to all the questions, but there's a couple that we can get to. One is a bit broad. John Vastola is asking best writing tips. You can mull over it. And I think I want to give perhaps another person who wrote a chant while you're thinking about it, rather than Vicente, you've already asked. So, Karl, best writing tips apparently.
Yeah, you have to set aside blocks of time. I found you really need a couple hours, at least an hour, maybe 2 hours to really get into the mode. You have to change. It depends on the kind of writing you're doing. When I write a paper, I can write parts of it anytime in between one or another thing. But for this book, I had to be in a completely different brain space. And so I carved out and set aside 2 hours, in these odd moments of the day. That's pretty important. Follow where your writing takes you. The first thing you write down is going to be terrible. The next thing is going to be slightly better. Just keep iterating. I was, even in the very last copy editing stage, I completely transformed, I think vastly for the better, like the ending of several of the chapters. And I didn't even quite realize how to make the connections until the last minute. So don't be discouraged when your first drafts are terrible. Mine certainly were, and just keep iterating and let the discoveries that come from the writing, let them manifest. Give them time to manifest.
That's great advice. So maybe one last one. I think Richard Hakim's question, if I can paraphrase, was that the approaches normally is sort of balancing sort of immediate activity. What about approaches where you're kind of opening up plasticity events, right? Making things change over a longer time, is giving examples of like ketamine and MDMA and so on.
Yeah, this is just now emerging into, I think really an effective approach. Optogenetics, for the first 10 years wasn't really applied to plasticity, but beginning with work from Christian Lucier and Robert Malinow and others, they showed you could very specifically turn up or down synaptic strength in defined pathways defined by their projections, and cause behavioral changes associated with that. We showed that later in 2015, but that work was in 2014. And so this works. You can definitely make interesting things like that happen. And that's kind of the real goal, is plasticity. If you want to change without continuing to provide a stimulus or medication, having a plasticity that's specific is really a very tantalizing prospect. And so we are starting to look at that. We're looking at, as you asked, about mechanisms of psychedelics, and including ketamine and others, and MDMA. Just in the early stages of this, we think we've got some pretty interesting results, though. Other people are working on this too, to great effect. So there's a huge opportunity if you're interested. I think it's wide open, and we have the right tools to really make an impact now.
Fantastic. So just past the 2 o'clock mark for you. So thank you once again, Karl, for taking the time, for writing the book, for taking the time and sharing your insights. And thank you all to the audience for joining us and for the great questions. And thanks to HBI again, Parizad and Adam, for sort of organizing this and hosting us. Thanks, and I really look forward to seeing you in real life, Karl, sometime soon.
I can't wait. Thanks, Venki. Thanks, everybody. If you have any questions, just shoot me a note. You know where to find me. So, thank you.
Bye.